friends with Stalin.
He's a communist. Oh, really? Yeah, big communist. Big communist. Oh.
Welcome to Leaping Larry's Revolutionary Reading Theatre.
Hey, welcome to the reading time, everybody. Today we're going to be reading from Foundations of Leninism. That up there. Go now, everybody's got the link to it. Reading from your chapter 4, Dictatorship of the Proletariat. Hell yeah! From this theme, I take 3 fundamental questions. A. The dictatorship of the proletariat as an instrument of proletarian revolution. B. The dictatorship of the proletariat as the rule of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. And C. Soviet power as the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. 1. Dictatorship of the proletariat is the instrument of the proletarian revolution. The question of the proletarian dictatorship is, above all, a question of the main content of the proletarian revolution. Proletarian revolution, its movement, sweep, its achievements acquire flesh and blood only through the dictatorship of the proletariat. Dictatorship of the proletariat is the instrument of the proletarian revolution, its organ, most important mainstay, brought into being for the purpose of, firstly, crushing the resistance of the overthrown exploiters and consolidating the achievements of the proletarian revolution, and secondly, carrying the revolution to the complete victory of socialism. Of course, means the establishment of a higher stage of communism. Revolution can defeat the bourgeoisie, overthrow its power, even without the dictatorship of the proletariat. But the revolution will be unable to crush the resistance of the bourgeoisie, maintain its victory, and to push forward to the final victory of socialism unless, at a certain stage in its development, it creates a special organ in the form of the dictatorship of the proletariat as its principal mainstay. Morning, Sam. The fundamental question of every revolution is the question of power, says Lenin. Does this mean that all that is required is to assume power, to seize it? No, it does not. Seizure of power is only the beginning. For many reasons, the bourgeoisie that is overthrown in one country remains for a long time stronger than the proletariat which has overthrown it. Therefore, the whole point is to retain power, consolidate it, make it invincible. What is needed to attain this? To attain this, it is necessary to carry out at least three main tasks that confront the dictatorship of the proletariat on the morrow, quote unquote, of victory. A. Break the resistance of the landlords and capitalists who have been overthrown and expropriated by the revolution, to liquidate every attempt on their part to restore the power of capital. B. To organize construction in such a way as to rally all the working people around the proletariat, and to carry on this work along the lines of preparing for the elimination of the abolition of classes. To arm the revolution, to organize the army of the revolution for the armed struggle against foreign enemies and the struggle against imperialism. The dictatorship of the proletariat is needed to carry out these tasks. Going to be from Lenin here. Quote, the transition from capitalism to communism, says Lenin, represents an entire historical epoch. Till this epoch is terminated, the exploiters inevitably cherish the hope of restoration. This hope is converted into attempts at restoration. And after the first serious defeat, the overthrown exploiters, who had not expected their overthrow, never believed it possible, never conceded the thought of it, throw themselves with energy grown tenfold, with furious passion and hatred grown 100-fold, into the battle for the recovery of the paradise of which they have been deprived, on behalf of their families, who had been leading such a sweet and easy life, and whom now the common herd is condemning to ruin and destitution, or to common labor. In the train of the capitalist exploiters follow the broad masses of the petty bourgeoisie, regard to whom decades of historical experience of all countries testify that they vacillate and hesitate, one day marching behind the proletariat, the next day taking fright at the difficulties of the revolution, that they become panic-stricken at the first defeat or semi-defeat of the workers, grow nervous, rush about, snivel, and run from one camp into the other. Unquote. Bourgeoisie has its grounds for making attempts at restoration, because for a long time after its overthrow, it remains stronger than the proletariat which has overthrown it. Quote, the exploiters are defeated in one country only, says Lenin, and this, of course, is the typical case. Simultaneous revolution in a number of countries is a rare exception. They will remain stronger than the exploited. Lenin again. We got a lot of Lenin coming up in this chapter. Just be aware, there's a lot of Lenin quotes here, okay? Wherein lies the strength of the overthrown bourgeoisie? Firstly, in the strength of the international capital, in the strength of the durability of international connections of the bourgeoisie and Lenin. Secondly, in the fact that, quote, for a long time after the revolution, the exploiters inevitably retain a number of great practical advantages. They still have money. It is impossible to abolish money all at once. Some movable property, often fairly considerable. They still have various connections, habits of organization and management, knowledge of all the secrets, customs, methods, means, and possibilities of management, superior education, close connections with the higher technical personnel who live and think like the bourgeoisie, incomparably greater experience in the art of war. This is very important, so on and so forth. Again, Lenin. Thirdly, in the force of habit, in the strength of the small production. For unfortunately, small production is still very, very widespread in the world. Small production engenders capitalism. And the bourgeoisie continuously, daily, hourly, spontaneously, and on a mass scale. Unquote. For the abolition of classes means not only driving out the landlords and capitalists, that we accomplished with comparative ease, it also means abolishing the small commodity producers, and they cannot be driven out or crushed must live in harmony with them. They can and must be remolded and re-educated only by very prolonged, slow, cautious organizational work. Again, Lenin. And that is why Lenin says the dictatorship of the proletariat is the most determined and most ruthless war waged by the new class against a more powerful enemy, the bourgeoisie, whose resistance is increased tenfold by its overthrow. That the dictatorship of the proletariat is a stubborn struggle, bloody and bloodless, violent and peaceful, military and economic, educational and administrative, against the forces and traditions of the old society. Lenin again. It scarcely needs proof that there is not the slightest possibility of carrying out these tasks in a short period, of accomplishing all this in a few years. Therefore, the dictatorship of the proletariat, transition from capitalism to communism, must not be regarded as a fleeting period of super revolutionary acts and decrees, but as an entire historical era, replete with civil wars and external conflicts, with persistent organizational work and economic construction, with advances and retreats, victories and defeats. Historical era is needed not only to create the economic and cultural prerequisites for the complete victory of socialism, but also to enable the proletariat, firstly, to educate itself, become steeled as a force capable of governing the country, and secondly, re-educate and remold the petty bourgeois strata along such lines as will ensure the organization of socialist production. Marx said to the workers, quote, "You will have to go through 15, 20, 50 years of civil wars and international conflicts." Marx said to the workers, "not only to change existing conditions, but also to change yourselves and to make yourselves capable of wielding political power." See Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Works volume 8, page 506. This? Yeah, this is that's the thing. Continuing and developing Marx's idea still further, Lenin wrote that it will be necessary under the dictatorship of the proletariat to re-educate millions of peasants and small proprietors, hundreds of thousands of office employees, officials, and bourgeois intellectuals, subordinate them all to the proletarian state and to proletarian leadership, to overcome their bourgeois habits and traditions, to overcome them, not to tail behind them. Mega communists, Midwestern Marxists, just as we must, in a protracted struggle waged on the basis of dictatorship of the proletariat, re-educate the proletarians themselves, who do not abandon their petty bourgeois prejudices at one stroke, by a miracle, at the bidding of the Virgin Mary, at the bidding of a slogan, resolution, or decree, but only in the course of a long and difficult mass struggle against the mass petty bourgeois influence. 2. The dictatorship of the proletariat as the rule of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. From the foregoing, it is evident that the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a mere change of personalities in the government, a change of the cabinet, etc., leaving the old economic and political order intact. The Mensheviks and the opportunists of all countries, who fear dictatorship like fire, and in their fright substitute the concept of conquest of power for the concept of dictatorship, usually reduce the conquest of power to a change of the cabinet, to the ascension of power of a new ministry made up of people like Schanman and Nozak, MacDonald and Henderson, which is, by the way, very similar to what Midwestern Marx is trying to do when they say That is why we needed free America from the monsters holding her in bondage. We'll get to that after. Notice the difference just in that there. You notice the difference in language between Stalin and Midwestern Marx? It is hardly necessary to explain that these and similar cabinet changes have nothing in common with the dictatorship of the proletariat, with the conquest of real power by the real proletariat. I saw Barry, fingers crossed for you, comrade, with the McDonald's and the Scheinmans of power, while the old bourgeois order is allowed to remain. Your so-called governments cannot be anything else than an apparatus serving the bourgeoisie, a screen to conceal the ulcers of imperialism, a weapon in the hands of the bourgeoisie against the revolutionary movement of the oppressed and exploited masses. And this is exactly, again, when you fail to deal with the contradictions and questions of like settler colonialism here, this is exactly what you're seeking to do. Again, to look at Midwestern Marx, this idea of freeing America rather than actually having a revolution that includes the liberation of First Nations. Remember, they even denied the category of settler altogether. Then what you were doing is seeking to build a socialism on top of settler colonialism. And that means you're not actually building socialism at all. Building a bourgeois socialism. You're just replacing one capitalism for another capitalism. Remember, we already have like bourgeois socialism in Canada and in the US. Right? It's planned economics for the bourgeoisie and chaos, anarchy, and production for the proletariat. Capital needs such governments as a screen when it finds it inconvenient, unprofitable, difficult to oppress and exploit the masses without the aid of its screen. Of course, the appearance of such governments is a symptom that over there, i.e., in the capitalist camp, all is not quite at a Shipka pass. Nevertheless, governments of this kind inevitably remain governments of capital in disguise. The government of a MacDonald or a Scheinman is as far removed from the conquest of power by the proletariat as the sky from the earth. The dictatorship of the proletariat is not a change in government, but a new state with new organs of power, both central and local. It is the state of the proletariat which has arisen on the ruins of the old state of the bourgeoisie. It can be hard. ANCOMs can be especially difficult because I honestly say like ANCOMs and liberals too. ANCOMs can be harder than dealing with like apolitical people because they have their mind like fully made up about the evils of socialism and stuff like this. It gets very, very difficult times. And I mean, myself had an anarchist phase, so like I understand it firsthand. But me, I didn't last long in the anarchist phase because I never believed the bullshit that the mainstream media was parroting about socialist states. Yeah, they get on authority, and then when they try and talk to you about authority, it turns out all they're talking about is the definition of authority. They're not even discussing actual authority with you. They're just discussing the definition of authority with you. Right? It's so frustrating, honestly. Wait, that a thing? There it is. Old Freddie Ingalls said something about that once. The dictatorship of the proletariat arises not on the basis of the bourgeois order, but in the process of the breaking up of this order. After the overthrow of the bourgeoisie in the process of the expropriation of the landlords and capitalists, the process of the socialization of the principal instruments and means of production, the process of violent proletarian revolution. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a revolutionary power based on the use of force against the bourgeoisie. So the thing is, when anarchists use force against the bourgeoisie in practice, when they, in any revolution, in any struggle they've engaged with, they are actually trying to build a dictatorship of the proletariat. It's just because they deny they're trying to do that, they always fail at doing that. Good luck, Barry. Salute. The state is a machine in the hands of the ruling class for suppressing the resistance of its class enemies. In this respect, the dictatorship of the proletariat does not differ essentially from the dictatorship of any other class, for the proletarian state is a machine for the suppression of the bourgeoisie. There is one substantial difference. This difference consists in the fact that all hitherto existing class states have been dictatorships of an exploiting minority over the exploited majority, whereas the dictatorship of the proletariat is the dictatorship of the exploited majority over the exploiting minority. Briefly, the dictatorship of the proletariat is the rule unrestricted by law and based on force of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie, a rule enjoying the sympathy and support of the laboring and exploited masses. Lenin, State and Revolution. From this follow two main conclusions. First conclusion: the dictatorship of the proletariat cannot be complete democracy. Democracy for all, for the rich as well as the poor. The dictatorship of the proletariat must be a state that is democratic in a new way for the proletarians and the non-propertied in general, and dictatorial in a new way against the bourgeoisie. Talk of Kautsky and Company about universal equality and pure democracy, about perfect democracy and the like, anarchists, is a bourgeois disguise of the indubitable fact that equality between the exploited and the exploiters is impossible. Think about that. We see this as well with direct democracy, is oftentimes here it framed as the direct democracy, right? Or real proletarian democracy, something like this. The theory of pure democracy is the theory of the upper stratum of the working class, which has been broken in and is being fed by the imperialist robbers, the labor aristocracy, in other words. It was brought into being for the purpose of concealing the ulcers of capitalism, of embellishing imperialism, and lending it moral strength in the struggle against the exploited masses. Under capitalism, there are no real liberties for the exploited, nor can there be. If for no reason than that the premises, printing plants, paper supplies, etc., indispensable for the enjoyment of liberties, are the privilege of the exploiters. Under capitalism, the exploited masses do not, nor can they ever, really participate in governing the country. If for no other reason than that, even under the most democratic regime, under conditions of capitalism, governments are not set up by the people, but by the Rothschilds, Steinesses, Rockefellers, and the Morgans. Democracy under capitalism is capitalist democracy, the democracy of the exploiting minority, based on the restriction of the rights of the exploited majority, directed against this majority. Only under proletarian dictatorship are real liberties for the exploited and real participation of the proletarians and peasants governing the country possible. Under the dictatorship of the proletariat, democracy is proletarian democracy, the democracy of the exploited majority, based on the restriction of the rights of the exploited minority, directed against this minority. Hey Rob, welcome in, comrade. Great to see you here. And of course, if that exploiting minority like Has and Hinkle try to do, includes anything other than the bourgeoisie and their ranks, then they have an unscientific analysis. For example, um, a famous take by Has and Hinkle that Midwestern Marxists have seen, of course, agree with, is that homeless people in America today are like the new landlords. Yeah, yeah. Try and figure that one out, because I sure as fuck can't. Second conclusion. The dictatorship of the proletariat cannot arise as the result of the peaceful development of bourgeois society and of bourgeois democracy. It can arise only as the result of the smashing of the bourgeois state machine, the bourgeois army, the bourgeois bureaucratic apparatus, the bourgeois police. Hey, it's from the thing. Quote, the working class cannot simply lay hold of ready-made state machinery and wield it for its own purposes, said Marx and Engels in the preface to the Communist Manifesto. The task of the proletarian revolution is, no longer as before, to transfer the bureaucratic military machine from one hand to the other, but to smash it. This is the preliminary condition for every real people's revolution on the continent, says Marx in his letter to Kogelman in 1871. Yeah, literally the opposite. Exactly, NTC. It's incredible. Incredible mental gymnastics it takes. Twist yourself up into a pretzel trying to explain that fucking one. Marx's qualifying phrases about the continent gave the opportunists and Mensheviks of all countries a pretext for clamoring that Marx had thus conceded the possibility of the peaceful evolution of bourgeois democracy into a proletarian democracy. At least in certain countries outside the European continent, Britain, America, Marx did in fact concede that possibility, and he had good grounds for conceding it in regard to Britain and America in the 70s of the last century, when monopoly capitalism and imperialism did not yet exist. Even then, I think Marx is incorrect, but that's a discussion for another time. And when these countries, owing to the particular conditions of their development, can as much as yet no develop militarism and bureaucracy. That was the situation before the appearance of developed imperialism. But later, after the lapse of 30 or 40 years, the situation in these countries had radically changed. When imperialism had developed and had embraced all capitalist countries, without exception, when militarism and bureaucracy had appeared in Britain and America also, when the particular conditions for a peaceful development in Britain and America had disappeared, then the qualification with regard to these countries necessarily could no longer hold good. Today, said Lenin, in 1917, in the epoch of the first great imperialist war, this qualification made by Marx is no longer valid. Both Britain and America, the biggest and the last representatives in the whole world of Anglo-Saxon liberty, quote unquote, in the sense that they had no militarism and bureaucracy, have completely sunk into all European filthy, bloody morass of bureaucratic military institutions, which subordinate everything to themselves and trample everything underfoot. Today in Britain, and in America too, the preliminary condition for every real people's revolution is smashing, the destruction of the ready-made state machine, perfected in those countries between 1917 and 1914 and 1917, up to the European general imperialist standard. In other words, the law of violent proletarian revolution, the law of smashing of the bourgeois state machine as the preliminary condition for such a revolution, is an inevitable law of the revolutionary movement in the imperialist countries of the world. Of course, if the remote future, if the proletariat is victorious in the principal capitalist countries, and if the present capitalist encirclement is replaced by socialist encirclement, a peaceful path of development is quite possible for certain capitalist countries, whose capitalists, in view of the unfavorable international situation, will consider it expedient to voluntarily to make supposition concessions to the proletariat. But this supposition applies only to a remote, possible future. With regard to the immediate future, there is no grounds whatsoever for this supposition. Therefore, Lenin is right in saying, quote, the proletarian revolution is impossible without the forcible destruction of the bourgeois state machine, the substitution for it of a new one. Anarchist Laboratory Sean, long time no see. Welcome in. Epgilasi, comrade. Great to see you here. Epgilasi means welcome. Wondering. Bazul means hello. Soviet power. Sorry. Number 3. We're just reading Foundations of Leninism. Great to see you, comrade. Welcome in. Again. Okay, number 3. Soviet power is the state form of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The victory of the dictatorship of the proletariat signifies the suppression of the bourgeoisie, smashing of the bourgeois state machine, substitution of proletarian democracy for bourgeois democracy. That is clear. But by what means, of what organization can this colossal work be carried out? The old forms of organization of the proletariat, which grew up on the basis of bourgeois parliamentarism, are inadequate for this work. Of that, there can be hardly any doubt. What then are the new forms of organization of the proletariat that are capable of serving as the gravediggers of bourgeois state machines, that are capable not only of smashing this machine, not only of substituting proletarian democracy for bourgeois democracy, but also of becoming the foundation of the proletarian state power? The new form of organization of the proletariat is the Soviets. Cue the USSR anthem. And in the case of DPRK, this is what they call the People's Assemblies. In USSR, they were called the Soviets. DPRK calls them the People's Assemblies. I think they're called like People's Assemblies in Cuba or something as well, if I'm not mistaken. So People's Assemblies, Soviets, same deal. It's the people's organs based on democratic centralism and secret ballot voting, 5-year terms, but no term limits. 5-year terms of voting, but 5-year terms of voting, but the same like person can be voted in as many years as you want, right? Like I know in DPRK there was one street cleaner lady who was like elected as chair of the Supreme People's Assembly something like 7 years in a row or something. It was a very loved street cleaner that lived there, and she was like a huge force in the Supreme People's Assembly, I guess. Because of course, at the Supreme People's Assembly, the Soviets, everybody has the right to talk and discuss things. And then by rules of democratic centralism, it's the majority vote is then accepted by all, right? Yeah, Soviet is just the word for council. So People's Council, People's Assembly, same thing. Yeah, exactly. National Assembly of yeah, same thing. And Cuba also has like the local people's assemblies as well. You want to see everybody? No, come back. Look, everybody. Look who's here. Bug. Somebody say hi, Bug. Bug gonna go quickly. Go quickly. Hi, Bug. Why? A buggy. Buggy. Her brother might be here today. Her brother might be here today. Not sure how I feel about term limits. Like, part of me thinks it's good, so because it forces change every decade or so. But if things are working as intended under, so yeah, no, term limits are unnecessary. Totally unnecessary. NTC. I don't think term limits are a necessary thing under socialism at all. Which is why I think when you see, I mean, you saw China not that long ago get away with term limits. Remember? And everybody was crying about Xi Jinping. They were like, "Oh, look, he's definitely a dictator. They just did away with term limits." Like they serve 5-year terms in DPRK on the Supreme People's Assembly, but there's no term limits, meaning the same people can be elected over and over again. Yeah, term limits are only for when your democracy is crap. Exactly. Exactly. So, if you can have if you have a correct foundation, you have can have no term limits so long as you have ways of recalling anyone not doing their jobs. Yeah. And that's why there doesn't need to be term limits, because the right of recall is of course a fundamental aspect of revolutionary party building. Yep. Same same here. Same here, Sean. And I mean that's what socialism tries to do as well. Socialism, I mean, let's not forget a lot of like the ideas for how to organize a socialist society were inspiration from were taken is inspiration from like First Nations organizations. Yeah, white people are allowed to have their dictatorships, March. When white people do it, it's not dictatorship. Where's Lasso? Well, you would all know what he would say, so that's the most important thing. Yep, NTC. Or if a leader's too popular with the people, it's a way to be like, oh, well, even though this leader's really popular with the people, term limits, you know? Which is why China wanted to get rid of it. So, this new form of organization of the proletariat is the Soviets, wherein lies the strength. Everyone follow K. How do you say, by the way? Hey, Nero Riot, welcome in, comrade. Shout out for K. Everybody follow K. Wherein lies the strength of the Soviets as compared with the old forms of organization? In that the Soviets are the most all embracing mass organization of the proletariat, for they and they alone embrace all workers without exception. In that the Soviets are the only mass organizations which unite all the oppressed and exploited, workers and peasants, soldiers and sailors, and in which the vanguard of the masses, proletariat, can, for this reason, most easily and most completely exercise its political leadership of the mass struggle. Yep, it's just council. So it's literally just like the People's Assembly in DPRK, the exact comparison. In that the Soviets are the most powerful organs of the revolutionary struggle of the masses, of the political actions of the masses, of the uprising of the masses, organs capable of breaking the omnipotence of finance capital and its political appendages. in that the Soviets are the immediate organizations of the masses themselves, i.e., they are the most democratic, therefore the most authoritative organizations of the masses, which facilitate to their utmost the participation in the work of building up the new state and its administration, and which bring into full play the revolutionary energy, initiative, and creative abilities of the masses in the struggle for the destruction of the old order, the struggle for the new proletarian order. Soviet power is the union and construction of the local Soviets into one common state organization, into the state organization of the proletariat as the vanguard of the oppressed and exploited masses, as the ruling class, your union in the Republic of the Soviets. The essence of Soviet power consists in the fact that these most all-embracing and most revolutionary mass organizations are precisely those classes that were oppressed by the capitalists and landlords are now the permanent and sole basis of the whole power of the state, of the whole state apparatus. That precisely those masses, which even in the most democratic bourgeois republics, while being equal in law, have in fact been prevented by thousands of tricks and devices from taking part in political life and from enjoying democratic rights and liberties, are now drawn unfailingly into constant and moreover decisive participation in the democratic administration of the state. Lenin. That is why Soviet power is the new form of state organization, different in principle from the old bourgeois democratic and parliamentary form, a new type of state, adapted not to the task of exploiting and oppressing the laboring masses, but to the task of completely emancipating them from all oppression and exploitation, to the tasks facing the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin is right in saying that, with the appearance of Soviet power, the era of bourgeois democratic parliamentarism has drawn to a close, and a new chapter in world history, the era of proletarian dictatorship, has been opened. Wherein lies the characteristic features of Soviet power? In that Soviet power is the most all-embracing, most democratic state organization of all possible state organizations, while classes continue to exist. The most democratic that is possible, while as long as classes exist, this is as democratic as you can get for the proletariat, for us. That's why it's unrestricted by law. The authority of the proletariat unrestricted by law against the bourgeoisie, who are restricted by proletarian law. The targets of proletarian law. And that is why, of course, DPRK concludes that one major way that this is accomplished is by turning the party, after the seizure of power, turning the party and the state into a motherly party, right? Into one that turns all of the officials into servants of the people. Because this is what is intolerable to the enemies of the people, right? And so that very facet alone ends up having the enemies reveal themselves so they can be isolated and re-educated. So, in that Soviet power is the most all-embracing and most democratic state organization of all possible state organizations, while classes continue to exist. 4. Being in the arena of the bond and collaboration between the workers, the exploited peasants, their struggle against the exploiters, and basing itself in its works on this bond and on this collaboration. Soviet power is thus the power of the majority of the population over the minority. It is the state of the majority, the expression of its dictatorship. In that Soviet power is the most internationalist of all state organizations in class society. 4. by destroying every kind of national oppression and resting on the collaboration of the laboring masses of various nationalities. It facilitates the uniting of these masses into a single state union. Notice it specifies destroying every kind of national oppression. Mid-Marxists? For any mid-Marxists who happen to be watching? In that Soviet power, by its very structure, facilitates the task of leading the oppressed and exploited masses by the vanguard of these masses, by the proletariat, is the most united and most politically conscious core of the Soviets. Quote, the experience of all revolutions and of all movements of the oppressed classes, the experience of the world socialist movement teaches us, says Lenin, proletariat alone is able to unite, lead the scattered and backward strata of the toiling and exploited population. Unquote. Here, that means the proletariat against the labor aristocrats as well. Vanguardism turns into a cult. Ay, ay, ay. Welcome, powerful. The point is that the structure of Soviet power facilitates the practical application of the lessons drawn from this experience. In that Soviet power, by combining legislative and executive power to a single state organization and replacing territorial electoral constituencies by industrial units, factories, and mills, thereby directly links the workers, the laboring masses in general, with the apparatus of state administration, teaches them how to govern the country. So instead of this general territorial electoral constituencies, the elections are based, and this is the way it is in DPRK, are based around the factories, the workplaces, and the mills, and the farms. So that's why, like in DPRK, like where Kim Jong-un went and voted in the last People's Assembly was at a steel mill, right? In that Soviet power alone is capable of releasing the army from its subordination to bourgeois command and of converting it from the instrument of the oppression of the people, which it is under the bourgeois order, into an instrument for the liberation of the people from the yoke of the bourgeoisie, both native and foreign. In that the Soviet organization of the state alone is capable of immediately and effectively smashing, finally destroying the old, i.e., the bourgeois, bureaucratic, and judicial apparatus. Lenin. In that the Soviet form of the state alone, by drawing the mass organizations of toilers and exploited into constant and unrestricted participation in state administration, is capable of preparing the ground for the withering away of the state, which is one of the basic elements of the future stateless communist society. The Republic of the Soviets is thus the political form so long sought and finally discovered within the framework of which the economic emancipation of the proletariat, the complete victory of socialism, must be accomplished. Paris Commune was the embryo of this form. Soviet power is its development and culmination. That is why Lenin says, quote, Republic of Soviets and workers, soldiers and peasants' deputies, not only the form of a higher type of democratic institution, but is the only form capable of ensuring the most painless transition to socialism. Unquote. And there you have it. Chapter 4.
I would have been friends with Stalin.
Next we'll be on Chapter 5, the peasant question. Oh yeah. Popular masses' aspiration and longing for socialism, which would provide them with genuine freedom and democracy. Yep. And that desire is exactly why they also have an interest in land back here. That desire for freedom and for the aspiration for true liberation and for true independence, exactly why they support land back here. Why the proletariat will support land back here. And of course, the bourgeoisie will have those in its ranks that it raises up to oppose land back,